So we are going to be talking to Dan from Canada. Let's just see
Hey,
if
thanks for having me on.
you there, Dan. Awesome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. It's been a nice, relaxing day for me. You guys
Wonderful.
had some good conversations so far.
Yes, absolutely.
Um,
So thank you so much for calling and keeping this party going. So what you got for us today?
I I had a question and a hypothetical for you. Um,
Okay, great.
and my question is pretty simple. Of all the hosting shows and things like that, has anybody presented a good argument for a deity? A plausible argument?
I think that the answer to that is no. There is a reason why these shows continue on and have plenty of people calling in, and we just keep making them because we have not found that proof yet, or something that makes sense or convinces us. I'll put it that way. Nobody has said anything yet that convinces us that there's a deity.
Yeah, it's kind of what I suspected the answer was going to be, but well, okay.
Sorry, I
So,
missed. I missed the start of that due to a tech issue. Are you asking, has anyone made a convincing argument for God? Basically.
like a
Essentially.
plausible argument for a deity, or at least an entertaining one.
Yeah, I guess.
I'm sure there's plenty of entertaining ones, whether or not
Yeah,
they're
well, I mean,
plausible.
that's what this show is, isn't it? Entertaining arguments for
Mhm.
God. I think that there are some plausible arguments for God in that if someone's like, oh, there is a creator of the universe, something has created the universe, and it doesn't care about people, and it just has done a thing, and it's not necessarily all powerful or whatever. It's just created the universe, and I call that God. I'd be like, well, I guess, like, I
Okay.
guess so. I mean, it could be, and it's kind of meaningless to me whether we call that God or just a natural process or, you know, magic space wizard or whatever. Like, but it's kind of plausible. So that's not a very exciting answer, but I guess that's kind of the point. It's like when you, because obviously God, defining God is just like a big argument we often have at the start of any conversation with a theist who's trying to do a more general argument. It's like, well, if you define God specifically enough, like it's the God of the Bible, then I can be like, what an argument I was going to bring up with the last caller is we can say, well, do you think your God is all moral? And then they're like, yeah. And you're like, well, do you think slavery is good? And they say no. And then you're like, well, your God thinks it's okay. So you're more moral than your own God. So therefore your God is bullshit. Any God that promotes slavery, we know isn't real. Like it's just ridiculous. Unless, of course, it's described as an evil, hateful God, in which case, fair enough. But an all-loving God that also just has a laugh when children die of cancer, like it doesn't. There's no that doesn't exist. It's a logical contradiction as far as I'm concerned, really. Um, but then that's when they do a specific one. But then if they do a more general one, there's this kind of line when you step past it. When you get into this point where you're like, well, God is any one thing that created the universe. It's like, okay. I mean, it's a bit like, when we say God created lightning, and then you're like, oh, actually, I'm going to define God as any one thing that creates lightning. And then you're like, oh, okay, so it's just like electricity in the clouds, in which case I do agree that your God exists, but it's just like electrons. I don't know. It's just something that's just happening. Maybe the universe was happened in a natural process, and that natural process we're calling God, and it's something that's not interesting. So I think there's kind of the problem with whenever you make an argument for God, if you make a specific one, then it's probably going to have a problem. And if you don't make a specific one, then it's like so uninteresting that I'm not really going to argue with it because it's like, yeah, I guess so.
Like, yeah, maybe. Could be. Sure.
But if we're doing funny stories, there is actually an episode of the Atheist Experience that I was on a couple of years ago, and we had someone call in, and their argument was the entire universe is made of crystals, therefore God. And we ended up going down a rabbit hole of like, what the hell do you mean by the whole universe is made of crystals? And like, what is a crystal to you? And how is that possible? Because a crystal is a structure, and so it can't be the smallest part. So what makes up the structure? But and then the call ended and it was over. And I really want to know how you? I wish we had just said, okay, yeah, everything's made of crystals. So, so where does how God from there? But
Yeah.
I guess I'll never know. So if that person is out there, like, please,
Call back and
I
explain it.
I am begging you.
But Dan, you also
I
mentioned that you had a question as well. So I was curious about that.
I did, seeing as how we've had so many great hypotheticals today. So, presuming that a deity is possible and exists, now, if they're outside of our universe and can somehow jam in the makings of our universe to expand into what we found before us, they could be a deity because they created the everything, but does that make them moral?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've raised several arguments as to why it doesn't.
I think something I've thought about before is like just imagine that tomorrow God shows up and like is literally just in front of you, like in an undeniable way where you just like, I am now convinced that God is real. And God is like, I want you personally to kill all left-handed people. You'd be like, that is immoral as fuck. I'm not doing that. And God's like, whoa, just go to hell forever then. Like hell is real. I'll show you what it's like. It's really bleak. Like if you were in a situation where you knew for sure that God was real and you also knew that God was evil, would you do the immoral thing that God was demanding, or would you go to like? I understand that it's got the kind of noble, like, hypothetical. I would take a stand and I would do the right thing. You would go to hell forever. Like that is literally unimaginably bad. Like I don't know where my line is. I mean, I'm not saying I'm coming for left-handed people or anything, but it, I, if you met God and it showed you hell and was like, this is a bad time. I don't know. What maybe you would do something immoral. So maybe an evil God is the most terrifying thing of all. I don't know. It could get you to do silly things. Though it couldn't get me to eat mayonnaise. So maybe I don't have a line.
Way to bring it full circle.
Yeah, what do you
Yeah, I
think?
mean, I think
Sinn.
that just by saying or just by proving that there is a God, that doesn't that in no way necessitates that it's somehow moral.
And looking at like some of the old world gods of I don't know if that's the right term actually, but looking at some of the gods of other societies like the Roman gods or the Greek gods or something, they're all wacky as shit. Like they do all kinds of
Mhm.
nonsense, cutting each other's heads off and having sex with their own half children and all kinds of bullshit. And as kind of the fun of them is like not just now looking
Yeah.
back, but at the time, knowing that these gods did. Because if you're, an ancient civilization and you're relying on this like field of wheat to grow, to survive, and then the field of wheat dies, you could be sort of God is all perfect and always does the right thing, and this must be my fault. Or you might just be like, man, God's a dickhead. And that's
Yeah.
kind of a nice way, and you'd be like, oh, this is the god of mischief and he's come and sorted the land. Like, what a total knobhead. We need the god of thunder to zap him with a lightning bolt. And it's more
Yes.
reassuring in a way, isn't it? Because there's a god of car crashes and a god of losing your sock in the washing machine and stuff, and that's it's you just like curse you. I don't know. So yeah, maybe some gods are immoral. Who knows? What do you think to that, Dan?
Well, that's kind of where this question has been kicking around my head for the last week or so, and I'm calling in with a slightly different perspective from some of the other callers, where I am not in any way smart enough to offer proof of the existence of a divine deity, but I kind of hope there is one. And so, it would be nice if they were moral and existed. And I'm just kind of...
It would be nice. It would be nice.
It'd
It
be
would
nice
be
if there was an afterlife where I
yeah.
got to see all the people who died. But I don't think it would be nice if there was. I'm not up for the Christian God being real, because
Yeah, that guy's a fucking
So
dick.
evil. It's so evil.
And his followers are assholes.
Some of them.
Like, no, I don't want to say all
Some
of
of
them,
my
but
best friends are Christian.
generalizing. Of course, I know beautiful people who believe in that guy, but
Yeah.
on the global scale, like the
gonna
bigger
say every
picture on the news, they look like jerks.
Yeah, at least one of them is a dickhead. That's for sure.
Oh,
But
Yeah, but I think that's the
Anyways,
whole
there was
thing
a
about
private
God in
question.
general anyway, is just that, or any of this stuff. Again, it's meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be comforting. Like coming to that rationality and that age of reason, it is so hard because you are having to let go of that paradigm that's shaped your life. That's like, all of this has a reason and all of this has a purpose. And but when you kind of realize, like, that's not necessarily true at all, it can be really jarring. And it would be nice if to know that someone out there's got our back, some being is taking care of us. But I think that we also just need to try to be comfortable with the idea that, like, that's not necessarily true. And you know maybe it's more helpful to not pretend like it is.
I
And it's
I
hard.
agree with that. It would be nice, but I also think that's kind of a I don't know. It's a bit of a privileged position because as someone who is like fairly privileged life as far as humans go, in the whole of history, I've had a pretty easy life, and it might be nice to think, oh, it's because God's looking out for me, and like, me and God have a nice relationship, and He's loving and caring. But like most humans have not had an easy life as me to be like a someone born in the 20th century compared to like all the other times. Like so many people have had such horrific lives, and then for me to be like, oh, God is there and He's looking out for you. Like sometimes you say that there are people alive today who have torturous lives, and to say to them, oh, God loves you and He's looking out for you and you just got
Ugh.
to have faith. And it's just kind of saying to them like, well, fuck you, because my God's nice to me and I'm not going to hear any disagreement, because if you say, well, I've got horrible life, then I presume that's got to be your fault because my God is always right. And then I just think it has a bad mentality. Like it's like, I don't think it's necessarily awful way to look at the world, but like I think it sets you up to go down these lines of like, especially when it's kind of like a global political scale. You're like, oh, there are all
Yeah.
these people in other countries who have a shit life pretty much so I can have a good life.
Yeah.
And I want to make the world a better place, but lots of people are like, nah, no, God loves everyone equally, and I'm sure He's looking out for them, and it's just the way the
Yeah.
world's meant to be. And then yeah,
It's a mystery.
God works in
God
mysterious
works
ways.
in mysterious ways.
He thinks that you should just earn the same amount every second as someone else works for an entire year. Yeah, it's just how God
Right.
works, So
Yeah.
but anyway, thanks for your call. It was a good discussion. I've lost the page. Hang on a sec.
Yeah, thanks for calling in, Dan.